before he speaks, we're going to see a 7-minute video. And after the video, Andrew will share his material with you and himself, which is a gift.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Nezzy, and thank you for the folks at AHHA for putting all this together, and thank you for all you coming out to see it. So today I'm here to talk about sustainable ways in which we can address homelessness and affordable housing through low-cost, community-oriented approaches, primarily in the form of tiny house villages. So to do that, I'll be referencing research from my new book, Tent City Urbanism, From Self-Organized Camps to Tiny House Villages. And I will also be referencing my work in helping to start Opportunity Village in Eugene, Oregon. And so this is actually my last of 4 presentations in the region this week, and they've all gone very well, very positive vibes. We had 300 folks out at Nevada City, about 100 in Eureka, and so just a lot of energy behind this. And I bring this up just to point out that this is not an idea unique to Eureka by any means, but it's an idea that's gaining a lot of momentum in the region. And if we zoom out, we see even more interest. So down in Southern California, we see 2 more village projects being planned, one in Santa Cruz and one in San Luis Obispo, both still in the planning stages. And then also up in the Northwest, we see 4 examples that have been legally sanctioned. So in Seattle, Olympia, Portland, and Eugene. So I'll get into each of those a little later on in the presentation. And so just to give you a brief outline of what we'll be doing today, I'll start off with just an overview of what exactly do I mean by tent city urbanism. So we'll look at some background information, some examples throughout the country, and then we'll cover 3 distinct models that I outlined for bridging the gap between the street and conventional housing. And we got a little introduction to Opportunity Village with that video, but then I'll go a little bit more in depth about how we planned it, how we built it. The village is an example of placemaking and some of the data that we've collected over the first 12 months of operation. And then we'll open it up for questions, which I believe will be done, as Nezzy pointed out, through the note card format. So I first got interested in this idea back in 2009 when I started reading about the rise of tent cities in the United States. There were largely signs of the time type pieces where they were using symbols with backdrops of city skylines as symbols of the national economic recession, with little attention to what was actually going on in these camps. So as an urban planning student at the time, I was taught to value the input of the people that you're planning for. And I felt these tent cities just might be optimal grounds for developing an alternative shelter model based on observing and interacting with the people who made them. So I decided to make that the focus of my senior thesis at the University of Cincinnati. So I began by mapping some of these places that I was reading about in the news, and I spent a summer going to visit some of them. So I started out in Cincinnati and went up to Ann Arbor, then Nashville and Athens, Georgia, and St. Petersburg, Florida. And then I was really inspired by what I saw in Ann Arbor, and I decided to move back there, and I stayed in the camp for a month to collect a little field research. What I ultimately found was that these camps were actually a lot more organized than they're being portrayed in the news media. So I defined the tent city as a nonviolent revolution that directly responds to an absence of place and participation in the American city. So ultimately what that comes down to is a battle of space, or a battle for space, that pits the formal city solutions, such as anti-camping regulations through policing, versus informal city solutions, which is camping out of necessity. So in most cities, what this ultimately results in is an unwinnable battle where the city may succeed in moving folks that are camping from one campsite, but only for them to move down the street to the next place. And so we're really moving the issue rather than coming up with any tangible solution. And so nowhere was this more clear to me than in Camp Take Notice in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And basically the same camp, the same group of people had been moved around the city 6 times, despite maintaining a well-organized camps with code of conduct and even weekly camp cleanup days. And so I decided to spend a month living in that camp to learn more about what was going on there, and I found several dynamics that actually addressed some of the shortfalls of some more traditional responses to poverty and homelessness. So looking at some of those dynamics, the first was direct democracy. So there were democratic meetings where everybody in the camp would gather, and this gave a voice to each of the residents to shape the community in which they lived. And this created a sense of agency where people that were used to going unheard were suddenly having a chance to have a say in how their community was organized. And then next is self-management. So during those meetings, folks would form committees that were elected to maintain a safe and sanitary camp. And there was a common interest in doing this so as to basically not jeopardize the existence of the camp as a whole. And then we basically have mutual aid, so people in a similar situation were working together to improve their individual situation rather than waiting for help being handed down from a social service provider. And then just a general sense of resourcefulness. So people were finding creative ways to adapt to living with less and finding ways to share resources and support each other. And so the question for me became, how can we maintain some of these positive social dynamics that are going on and combine that with improved physical infrastructure? So in short, progressing from camp to village. And so there were a few sanctioned examples already out there at the time, and that's where I'll turn to next. First, we have Tent City 3 and Tent City 4 in Seattle, and both of those were around, they've both been sanctioned for over a decade each, and they both have populations of 100 people, and they are self-governed with oversight provided by a nonprofit organization called ShareWheel. And basically, you can see some of these characteristics I'm talking about here, where you have an existing resident helping a new resident secure dry shelter. And then if you can see the woman walking down the path in the security vest, she's one of the ladies that is on front desk duty at the time. So they split hours to do someone at the front desk 24/7 to ensure that the camp's safe and going according to plan. And so the defining characteristic of this model is that they have to pick up and move every 3 months. So basically, there's a network of churches and a couple of universities that host the camp, and they move around to a network of different hosts every 3 months. In St. Petersburg, Florida, we find a more permanent model in Pinellas Hope. And so it's good that this is more permanent, but it's definitely organized in a different way. So it was a self-organized camp, but so basically a social service agency came in and instituted a top-down style of management, which took decision-making out of the hands of the people. And so here we see kind of a rigid grid with a security shack where a paid security staff member is hired to sit and look down long lines of tents, kind of symbolizing the very militaristic origins of the grid. And so this basically resembles kind of a traditional homeless shelter, only outdoors, and that wasn't necessarily what I was going for. So I found the best existing example to be Dignity Village in Portland, which kind of combined the autonomy of Tent City 3 and connected that with the permanence of Pinellas Hope. And so here we see an early picture of Camp Dignity, a nomadic tent city at the time, where folks were gathering in tents facing common open spaces. And then in 2001, the city offered a 1 acre of sanctioned land. So we see folks moving out of tents and into slightly more advanced structures, but still very ephemeral. They're only there for a year. And then here we see a more recent photo, I believe from 2013, where folks have moved into more substantial micro-housing built largely out of recycled and donated materials. And so here I just wanted to quote an architect friend, Mark Lakeman, who helped get this project off the ground there in Portland back in 2001. And he says, "We can talk about homelessness, but what I'm really excited about is the power of the village. The idea that a group of people can undertake democratic processes in such a way that they can repair themselves and create a sustainable expression of place. I think that's of interest to everybody." And so that brings us to some of the more current examples. So there's a little bit of gap there. And then in 2013, we see the opening of Opportunity Village, which was approved as a transitional micro-housing pilot project. And so a lot of similarities here between what was going on at Dignity Village, but also a lot of differences. We met with the folks at Dignity Village several times, and they gave us a lot based on if you guys could start now, what would you do differently? And probably the most notable piece of advice was the structure of our nonprofit organization. So Dignity Village is very internally organized, where the folks that live there actually compose the nonprofit, the members and the board of the nonprofit. They're actually out by the airport, so it actually creates a very isolated and inaccessible model. Whereas they suggested that we form a separate board structure. So we have the village, which is self-managed, and then we also have a nonprofit organization that's physically separate, that has a board of directors of community members like myself, Dan Bryant, who was talking there, and a number of others, and it also includes residents from the village. So it's basically the village is self-managed with oversight provided by this community-supported nonprofit. So I'll get a little bit more into Opportunity Village in the second half, but for right now I'm just going to cover some of the existing examples that are out there. So Quixote Village opened a few months after us, just before Christmas of 2013. They had been a rotating tent city similar to the one in Tent City 3 and Tent City 4, where they were rotating around to different churches every 3 months for about 7 years. And ultimately, the whole time they were planning this larger village model. So at the end of 2013, they were able to move into this 30-unit tiny house village that's, again, supported by a common structure that includes a kitchen and gathering areas and meeting space and restrooms with showers. And so until then, it was kind of this very unique idea kind of sprouting in the Pacific Northwest. But more recently, we see the emergence eastward. So we see Second Wind Cottages in Ithaca, New York. And so here we see a group of volunteers out building, I believe, 8 tiny houses of about 300 square feet. And so they've completed those, and those are open now. And I believe they're set to build 8 more later this year. And this is the one I really like. So it's OM Village in Madison, Wisconsin. It's currently under construction, and they're adaptively reusing an old auto shop. So the garage where they used to repair cars is now being used to build tiny houses, and they're also renovating that facility to have bathrooms and a common gathering facility and a kitchen. And then they're tearing up the asphalt where the cars used to be parked around it and placing tiny houses around there. So I think that's a really cool idea. And then lastly, we have Community First Village in Austin, Texas, which is a 200-unit community, so the most ambitious so far. And what this is really actually doing is offering a very low-cost housing model. So they're going to have different forms of micro-housing that will cost folks between $120 and $400 a month. So it's kind of filling that gap between, something like a tent city or a transitional village, and then conventional housing, which I don't know what the cost around here is, but it's much higher than that, right? So basically what I'm talking about here is bridging the gap between the street and conventional housing, which, as you heard in the PBS video there, is coming at a cost of upwards of $200,000 a unit. And so at the same time, we also see a lot of data coming out telling us about the high cost of doing nothing, the fact that leaving folks on the street comes with a price tag itself. So in Utah, we have they found about $20,000 per person per year. Florida, they found $30,000, and in Colorado, they found $40,000 per person per year. And so in my book, basically what I'm trying to do here is define 3 distinct models for bridging that gap between the high costs of the street and the high costs of conventional low-income housing to create some models that we can develop as a community without dependence on public subsidy. And so first, I guess we begin with the sanctuary camp. So the basic idea here is just allowing folks with no other place to go to camp in safe and sanitary conditions on sites that are appropriate for human habitation rather than in wetlands or in forests or in environmentally sensitive areas, which so often happens. And so here we have a very ephemeral infrastructure where folks are still in tents and larger canopies for common areas that can be easily relocated if necessary to serve as maybe a short-term lease or a pilot project. Similar to like Tent City 3 or what I was talking about in Camp Take Notice. And while this may not seem like very much, it establishes some of the very most essential elements of home in stability, security, privacy, and the ability to stay warm and dry. And so next we have the transitional village model where folks can move out of tents and into very basic micro-housing. And the idea here is basically to create a stepping stone between the street and conventional or not conventional necessarily, but more permanent housing. And the idea here is to be able to ultimately serve more residents than the number of units you have. And so basically it's a similar idea of what you were seeing with the self-organized camp, except just kind of improving the infrastructure. And then finally we have the affordable village model, which offers very accessible and sustainable places to transition to, as well as a place for folks that are at risk of losing their current housing. And so basically this is an alternative take on conventional low-income housing based on the similar village model that we see in the tent city and the transitional village. And so here the housing is slightly larger, more permanent, more livable, and residents pay a modest monthly fee and ideally accrue equity. And so to take a look at these three models, an on-the-ground sort of look, basically we have the sanctuary camp, and then moving into very, very basic micro-housing in the transitional village. And then in the affordable village, we see the more robust tiny houses that you might be familiar with if you're following the tent city movement at all, which a lot of people, there's a lot of articles coming out on the newspaper, or in the newspaper and online about just the idea that people are, already house folks are choosing to downsize into these type of structures. So this is kind of somewhere in the middle where it's a chance to upsize for those with very little and also a chance to downsize for those that have a little bit more. So the basic idea here is to combine a very small private space and connect that with common facilities and basically support within a community. And so basically this creates a hybrid land use that combines the privacy and character of the single-family house with the economy and density of a multifamily building, and then also adds a sense of community that's kind of gone missing from a lot of those single-family houses and apartment buildings. And so that kind of gives you the basic overview, and now I'm going to get into a little bit more of the Opportunity Village that you saw the video of. And so the story of Opportunity Village basically starts with the Occupy camp. And like many cities, Eugene witnessed the emergence of a very large protest camp. And so that basically started as a place for otherwise housed protesters to make a statement and coming together. And the tent city basically symbolized the larger voices they were trying to make. But like many other cities, that quickly also became a place of refuge for the homeless. And when that camp was evicted at the end of 2011, it was estimated that there were around 200 homeless folks living at the camp in Eugene. And so rather than turning a blind eye or doing nothing, our mayor's compromise for displacing so many folks was to create a task force called the Opportunity Eugene Task Force. And that task force involved a broad range of different participants from the school district to the police department to city officials, and also included housed and unhoused representatives from the Occupy camp. And the number one recommendation that came out of that task force in early 2012 was basically to establish a safe and secure place to be 24/7. And so from there, a group of us continued to meet informally, much like the folks at AHHA, maybe similar to that, where you have some community activists coming together around a common idea. And we're basically trying to determine what this safe place to be should look like, how it should be organized. And so we developed a concept plan, and we went through a number of iterations, but ultimately ended up with this 3D model, which combines clusters of micro-houses supported by common facilities. And so through that process, we were going through the process of forming an official 501c3 nonprofit organization, but things were still going pretty slow at the city level, so there were a couple things that happened that I think really greased the wheels to get Opportunity Village to happen in our town. One was the emergence of a separate group, direct action group called Sleeps, and they basically was a loosely organized group of homeless folks where there were tent cities were popping up all throughout the city, very small, and basically just calling attention to the fact that it's illegal to sleep, and they're doing this in very visible places. And then at the same time, our group was developing our first prototype for a microhouse. So you see the Conestoga hut here. And these two pictures are actually right across the street from each other outside of City Hall. And so basically it creates a strong juxtaposition of a very long and prominent issue that's very highly vocalized in our community next to a solution that was going unused at the time. And so this was right before they were about to meet for the umpteenth time to talk about the homeless issue. And there were two things that really productive things, I think, that came out of that meeting. So the first was the Conestoga hut, our initial prototype, was adopted into our car camping program. So in non-residential sites around the city, you're allowed to host up to 3 RVs or cars for folks to camp in a safe environment. It's largely like churches and nonprofits and even some businesses that choose to do that. And this basically allowed the Conestoga to also be included in there, which can be built for around $1,000. And so that makes it a lot more accessible to folks that don't necessarily have access to a car or an RV. And so now we have dozens of those throughout the city. And the second part of the meeting was basically that the city council approved a pilot project for a 30-unit village, roughly for a little over 1 year. And so they started, basically the city council directed city staff to figure out how to make this happen, identify potential sites and a legal process for doing so. So they started by identifying 6 potential city-owned sites, and it was ultimately narrowed down to this site at North Garfield, which is basically, it used to be a trailer park that was shut down, and the city took it through eminent domain and was using it lightly for city vehicle storage. So they gave it to us as a temporary pilot project, ultimately wanting to build a more substantial storage facility there. So they basically gave us a little window to try out what we were talking about. And basically that required a conditional use permit. So here's a look at the site. And then, so it's a 2-acre site. We took the front acre, and then they continued to, they moved whatever they were storing into the back acre so that, we didn't necessarily bite into that. And part of the idea here is making use of all that underutilized land throughout the city. And so here we're applying that concept plan that I showed you of the 3D model to the specific site. And then this is just the site plan, the technical piece that we actually turned into the city and ultimately got approved. And so during this whole technical process and legal process of getting it recognized, we were simultaneously going through a community building process. So we formed a committee to collect applications and interview some of our first residents, and we ultimately selected a dozen folks, and they ended up meeting, for that 3 months that it takes to go through a conditional use permit. They were meeting in the church basement of Dan, who you saw in the video. And basically the idea there was, we were starting that collaboration between the housed and the unhoused, where the ultimate product that came out of that was the village manual. And so that basically explains probably a lot of the questions you guys all have about how this place is maintained and how it's operated and how it's governed. And so that's available on my website, which I'll have a link to at the end of this. And it's kind of like the constitution of the village. And so if that's the constitution of the village, the preamble is the community agreement, which basically outlines the basic rules and the basic principles that guide the basic idea behind the village model. And then the village manual is basically more of a technical piece that further extrapolates on all that. And I believe Jim included that in all your packets, so you should all have a copy of the community agreement. But basically it operates under 5 basic rules of no violence, no theft, no alcohol or illegal drugs on site, no persistent disruptive behavior, which is always the most objective one. And then everyone must contribute to the operations and maintenance of the village. So it's not only things you can't do, but also everybody's required to contribute back to the village. And so that comes out to looking something like 8 hours towards front desk duty, and also 2 hours towards general operations and maintenance, that folks can choose what they want to do, serve on the donations committee or the kitchen committee, number of different things going on there. So that was going on, and then we ultimately received our city approvals in August of 2013, so there you can see building permit in hand. And then we get to the fun part where we get to build it. So we put up 5 tiny houses in the first day that we got on site. So that included probably about 100 folks of volunteers and the initial residents that came out and made that happen. We also dug a 200-foot ditch to run water from basically the street to where the kitchen would eventually stand. And to give you basically an idea of how we're doing this and how we're able to put up 5 of these in one day, we basically use a modular panelization technique, basically creating 4x8 panels. And so each house is made out of about 12 to 20 of these modular insulated panels, and then they go together basically like a puzzle. So we move them all to the site, basically when we had like 4 or 5 completed, and then at the end of the month they would go up during a collaborative work party. And so here's just a drawing of basically taking those panels and putting them together. And really the idea here is taking the technical end of home building out of basically in the panel part. So we're basically prefabricating these panels And after that, it makes it so that just about anybody can really help pick up a hammer and just kind of put these things together. So here we'll just look at a few photos of the structures coming together. So we built it basically over the course of 9 months. 9 months. We started out with 5 structures and then incrementally added them. And here you see one of those clusters starting to come together. And basically the idea here is that these are detached bedrooms, and that's basically how we were able to put them up so quickly. And then supported those with shared common areas. So there was a common bathroom. This is a 112 square foot bathhouse, so it includes 2 restroom facilities with toilets and sink, and then a shower room, and then also around back there's a laundry facility. And so all of this was built. Basically, a big design constraint that we had to follow was that this was only a year-long pilot project, so we had to design everything so that it could ultimately be picked up and moved if we had to, but we also wanted to do so in a way that it was substantial and aesthetic enough that people would like what they saw. So here we have this highly functioning bathhouse, but all the plumbing and sewer is actually built into the floors, so ultimately it could be put on a trailer and moved if we ever had to. And here you see the kitchen under construction. Basically, the idea is connecting 2 of the houses underneath a shared canopy, and in those houses we have, a sink, refrigerator, microwaves, storage pantry, and then outside we have the. It's not shown in this picture, but behind that canopy we built a covered deck, sort of gazebo, which is basically like a barbecue sort of area. And then this was the most difficult structure to figure out, so we had to figure out a structure that could be moved, but that could also hold 30 to 40 folks to gather and meet on a regular basis. And we ultimately came up with the Pacific yurt. Did I lose that? No? All right. And so we also ultimately ended up with a 30-foot wide yurt. And so here we see the yurt's heated with a pellet stove, and basically serves as the village's primary gathering space. And so just a review of what's on site. At a most basic level, everybody has access to an address, a phone number, and internet access. And then we have the front desk, so that's basically at the front of the village, and that's where we have folks, basically everybody in the village hosting that and splitting administrative duties. And then we have the 30 micro houses, the common bathhouse, the common kitchen, the common gathering area. We have a donation storage area, so a lot of folks in town will bring in different things that they have left over, and then some of the villages are on a committee to take that inventory and then also open it up for folks in the village to come and access different things at different times. And then we have the mobile tool shop, which is the newest addition, which has basically resulted from a partnership with the University of Oregon, where the architecture students came out and helped build this mobile tool shed, and now it gives villagers access to tools so that they can modify their individual units. People are working on ways of creating alternative energy and also trying to come up with ideas of income-generating activities. So here we're going to look at the village as an example of placemaking. And so what I mean by that is taking a space and investing value and meaning in that space. So here we see the picture right before getting on site in August of 2013. And in less than 1 year later, we see a place where people live and gather. And so in these next few slides, I want to talk about the kind of collaboration that has occurred simply by making space available for existing resources in our community. So first, we start with the village meeting, which is kind of the central, pivotal point of the village model. And this is where everything gets hashed out and talk about issues and how to address problems, the good, the bad, the ugly. And next, you have the council meeting. So during those village meetings, 7 folks are elected to the village council. And basically, they have an additional responsibilities of developing the agenda for the meeting, adjudicating disciplinary responses for folks that are breaking the rules. But ultimately, everything can be reviewed at the village meeting, so that doesn't necessarily give the village council more hierarchical powers. And then we also have the support committee, so folks from the house community and the surrounding community that have been involved in starting the project, and just folks out there, how can I help? We basically have a weekly meeting where folks can come and meet with villagers, and basically they kind of help with general logistical type of stuff and also some sort of mentoring if villagers are looking for that. And so we've developed a number of partnerships with existing service providers in our community. So the faith-based community has been a big part of that. As you saw in the video there, we have 2 church pastors on our board, and we've also seen a lot of congregations coming out and helping us build it and make it happen along with the residents. We've gotten a lot of technical support from the University of Oregon, particularly their architecture program. And then we have places like Whitebird and Cahoots and Women's Space, which are existing service providers in our community that get funding to go out to the community to provide those services. And so rather than duplicating that by providing an on-site service provider, we basically have connections with them, and they come to our meetings. And Whitebird comes out and offers conflict mediations. One of the most significant issues we've run into is domestic violence between couples and in one unit, and where other villagers, witness something like that happening. So our response to that was to develop a partnership with Women's Space, which is basically an organization in our community out there to educate folks on how to preemptively address those sort of issues. And so they've come to our meetings a couple times and basically made their services available to villagers. And then we also have Food for Lane County, Eugene Mission, St. Vincent de Paul, Eugene Rotary Club has been a big supporter. And also we have a board member from the Community Alliance of Lane County. So here we have Watch Opportunity Work. So one of our residents used to be a computer programmer, so that when he lost his job, basically he ended up in the village, and what he developed was this application on our website where folks in the larger community can log on to basically search for villagers based on goals, needs, and skills so that they can hire folks or help however needed. And so a number of villagers have been able to get basically occasional work to pay off that $30 a month utility fee. And so with a stable place to be, we also see the ability for folks able to invest in their immediate surroundings. So gardening serves as an example of that. And then also in the larger community, basically having a stable place to be allows people to invest back in their neighborhood. So here we have an example of basically our city was facing a big budget cuts, and we had to close a number of public bathrooms throughout our parks and our cities. And the village volunteered to help maintain the bathroom in an adjacent park to the village. So that's just an example of how something like this, where the folks in the village can be an asset to the community rather than a Band-Aid. We give a lot of tours. So here you see the villagers giving a tour to the Department of Public Works, which is our neighbor. And we've also been selected to be stops on the tours for the National Neighborhood Summit and the League of Oregon Cities. So that just gives you kind of an idea of the respect that our city has for us, the fact that the city of Eugene is selecting us to be stops on their national tours. And so this is one of my favorite. Our original site that we proposed was adjacent to a school, and we took a lot of heat from parents for ever, even considering that idea. And now we have school children coming out to the village for field trips to learn about homelessness on a very personal and direct basis. Special community events. An example of this was the wedding you saw in the video. So a unique thing about our model is that it allows couples to stay together. Most existing services out there require couples to separate in order to get services, and so that's why you see a lot of folks camping out in the woods. We've even had a couple come in that was camping out in the national forest that they're married and they don't want to be separated, so they're looking for solutions where they can stay together. And another piece is also the animals. So a lot of folks out there have pets, so we also accommodate pets up to a certain degree. And then this is just a mobile tool shop, so we put on some different workshops. Here we have a bike repair workshop going on when the University of Oregon architecture students first dropped it off for us. And then community education. This is another one of my favorite ones, where professors from the University of Oregon have come out and taught educational courses at the village for free, both for villagers and members of the surrounding community that might not find education particularly accessible. So it started as a pilot program where 6 professors from different backgrounds came out and taught an hour-long lecture on what their discipline's definition of justice was. So it was very, tied to this idea. The villagers are very always weighing on justice. Basically, it's a self-managed community, and they have to make a lot of decisions like that on a daily basis. So it was very applicable. But basically, that's a pilot program in order to ultimately, hopefully, serve a larger thing where we can have a regular community education courses offered in our year. And so here we'll look at some of the data that was collected over the first 12 months. So we have a fairly even breakdown of males and females, veterans, disabled folks, and also some folks that are employed or students. And the capital costs, so this doesn't cost a lot of money. We did it for about $3,300 a unit, and that didn't include any public funding, so it's basically just community support. And we estimate that basically we had another 114 in in-kind donations, so we had a lot of volunteer labor and a lot of donated materials that really helped us keep those costs low. The operating costs, so it costs just over $2,000 to run this place, and that comes out to under $1,000 per person per year. So then if we connect that back with that Florida finding that doing nothing is costing over $30,000 per year, and if we look at the fact that we're housing 35 people in a village like this, that's a saving of over $1 million. And so residents pay $30 a month towards utilities. So that covers basically half of our operating costs. We also have insurance, and we're also having to pay back a bond on the land. So those are two of our bigger costs that are currently being covered by private donations of about $1,000 per month. And ultimately, we'd like to develop some sort of income-generating activity that can make it a self-sustaining model. So again, looking at that cost of conventional low-income housing, whereas the units at OVE could be built for 60 to 1, and that's not to say that they're on an equal level by any means, but saying that you can drastically improve the conditions that folks are living in on the street for very little money. We had 5 calls to 911 in the first year, 0 calls or complaints by neighbors, and we've actually had an endorsement in our local paper by the police department saying that the village has not been a burden to the surrounding area in terms of crime. It's a self-governed community, so we've had 58 folks staying there for various lengths of time over the course of the year. 15 have made voluntary transitions to apartments or moving in with friends or family or such. And 11 folks were asked to leave for not following the rules. So I think both of these kind of designate the emergence of a self-governed community where you have some successful transitions happening based on a supportive community, and it's also showing that we are following our rules and that allowing a group of homeless folks together to live together doesn't automatically result in lawless anarchy. And so political support may be the biggest thing I can talk to you guys about. So it was approved as a pilot project through October 1, 2014. We faced a little bit of adversity on the first site we proposed, which was more in a residential area, but they ultimately found a site for us at the Garfield site, which only had, I think, around 100 residents within 600 feet radius. So there was less folks living there. But basically, it was still within a neighborhood association, and we were able to, preemptively meet with those folks in the neighborhood. And ultimately, it comes down to a conditional use permit hearing where folks have the ability to speak for or against a project. And nobody actually stood up to speak against the project. And we were told that that was probably the first time that that's ever happened in a land use case, let alone a homeless land use case. And so we got that, and we were up for a year. And just a couple of months ago, based on a recommendation for staff, the city council approved a 2-year extension, or maybe a year and a half, basically on an 8-0 vote, which is a very uncommon thing in our city and probably in most cities. So that kind of shows you the unified support behind this. And we also have a quote from our city councilor who represents that district in which the village is in which she has said she's received 0 complaints regarding Opportunity Village. And so with the completion of Opportunity Village, we are now focused on developing more accessible places to transition to. So our next project, Emerald Village, will offer long-term housing based on a similar village model. We found that many of our residents have some source of income, but they're not necessarily able to afford that next step without some form of public support, which just isn't there for everybody. So the idea here is to create a very low-cost housing option, similar to what I was talking about in Austin. So the folks here will pay about $200 a month to live in one of these tiny houses. And basically, it's the idea of starting with that transitional model, and now we're focused on, okay, we have this, now how do we get some of these folks to transition to other places? And so it's about creating more permanent, accessible places for folks to transition to. And we believe we can do that by building small and basically utilizing existing community resources. And so lastly, I had this slide in here from Nevada City, but I wanted to include it here just to give you guys an idea of things that are happening not so far away. So we have Sierra Roots, which is kind of an existing nonprofit organization, and they've connected with Chuck Durrett, who's the co-housing architect, and he's done a little bit of technical plans for them. So it's just basically a very early conceptual prototype. And then while we were there, we also went and visited a John Muir charter school where it's called Youth Build, where kids that are 18 to 25 are basically being they get a stipend to come and learn construction skills so that they can become contractors and make a living off of that. So we have that are already building houses, and found out that 9 of them themselves were actually homeless. And you have to pass a drug test to get into that program, so that I think dispels any myths that all homeless folks are addicted to drugs. But basically, it was really cool to see that we have these folks out there that are learning how to build houses, that need to build houses. And so that's kind of generating some energy in Nevada City. And here's just another early conceptual drawing of that. And that's the conclusion.
For being part of the village.
Sure. Yeah, so basically we opened in August 2013. We selected our first 30 residents who were already living in the Eugene community, basically through an application and interview process. And I don't know, do you guys have some of those applications here? But basically, it just asks some basic questions about, where did you sleep last night, and basically gives people an idea of who they are. And then there's a vetting committee that's basically composed of anybody in the village that wants to be on that committee, plus liaisons from the board of directors. And so those first 30 were selected, and we're full, basically. When did we fill up? We basically filled up in May, and yeah, we've had an extensive waiting list ever since then, and so they're kind of developing the policies of how to best go about that. But basically, the way that we've chosen our residents is based on relationship building, so it's the folks that show up and help make this happen. So you saw we did a lot of the building activities, so a lot of we had our original dozen, and then the rest of the folks are basically selected the people that showed up and made it happen. And now that we're already existing and all the buildings are up, we're finding other creative ways to do that. Folks just showing up, coming to the meetings, or helping do some maintenance around the village and such.
Okay, thank you. And how about funding sources?
So yeah, we've operated entirely off of private donations. So I think it cost about $100,000 to build. So it's basically a lot of small private donations. Now that we're looking to do Emerald Village, we're applying to some of those larger private foundations.
Okay, thank you. And how are your board members selected?
Basically, the original core group were just the folks that were making it happen, and then we wanted to diversify and add some representation. Okay. One of the issues that we faced was, we had strong political support from the beginning, where folks were like, this is a really good idea, we're just not so sure you guys can make it happen. And so basically what we did then that I think really changed things was adding some folks on our board that are really well rooted in our community, like Dan Bryant, and that basically gave us, I think, some credibility. And I think we developed our board, and then we also have added residents. So there's also 2 to 3 residents on the board as well.
Great, thank you. What about the use of existing RV parks or incentives to property owners that might be able to donate land for such a place?
Well, I believe you can get a tax write-off. That's one incentive. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things we're looking at now. We started with city-owned land, and now we're starting to look at private land. And just, I think, there's folks out there that are interested in this idea that want to give us a good deal. So, yeah, just connecting.
Okay. Great. And there's a question here that's kind of specific to our community about the legacy community potential sites that are in the housing element, and perhaps that can be addressed at the workshop on building blocks. How about, and we have a suggestion about farm worker housing. We have a perceived large number of people who are migrants through here, particularly for our marijuana laborers, who do not have housing provided for them. Has that been discussed, farm worker housing?
In Opportunity Village?
Yeah.
No, Nezzy was talking to me about it, and it sounds like an interesting concept, but no, that's not necessarily something that we've considered at OVE.
Okay. There's a question or two about whether there are social enterprises being developed to help support the village.
Yeah, so that's one of the big ideas. Basically, we're focused on getting it up and going, and now I think we're entering into phase 2, where we're trying to develop some of those micro businesses.
Do you have, like what?
Yeah, one of the ideas, so the idea is to keep it very basic. So one of the ideas is to collect down trees throughout the city. There's a service where you can call and they'll notify you, and you go and collect that, chop it up into firewood, and sell bundles of firewood. And basically, that's where folks come to get their firewood. So that's just one example of something very simple. You know, opening a food cart. So we're in an industrial area where there's a lot of workers, but there's no place to eat. So that's another idea.
Okay, and there were several questions about how you work with behavioral health issues, folks that might have mental health, substance abuse, or dual diagnosis issues.
How do we deal with that?
Yeah.
I mean, so there's basically, there's the rules, and so folks that can't follow those rules at Opportunity Village are eventually asked to leave. That happened 11 times in a year. So it's not a solution for everybody, but I think you can apply this similar concept to various models to direct it at different demographics. One of the examples I didn't include was Right to Dream 2 in Portland. And basically what they do is they allow 30 people to live on site permanently, 24/7, and then they also have 60 spots for folks to come in and spend the night. And so that kind of is a really good solution for accommodating some folks that might not be able to exist within a community, you know, on a social level.
Permanent, kind of more permanent. Okay, and thank you. How did you get the planning department to work with you and approve the use of this?
The city council told them to.
The city council told them to. I hope someone writes that down. Okay, thank you.
And I can also say, you know, I showed a slide there that kind of created some of that momentum of like showing that, you know, there were folks camping in very visible areas, and then there was this organization that was offering, you know, these micro housing solutions, and I think that just kind of created some energy for it. But it also, you know, we had that initial task force, and they made that recommendation, so we basically held them to following through with something they already said they wanted to do.
Thank you. And that group that made the recommendations was a local group that
Well,
worked
it was a task force that, you know, it included representation from all the important places around town.
Okay, great. Thank you. Have you had liability issues or lawsuits?
No, we have liability insurance, though. That was one of the requirements by the city.
And what about issues of distance to town or distance to services? I think people are looking at either wondering about transportation.
Yeah, that's a really big issue because like Dignity Village, which got approved back in 2001, is all the way out by the airport, which is about a 40-minute bus ride down to downtown. So we are in a not-so-residential area, but we found a not-so-residential area that's not necessarily so far away from everything. So we're right on a bus stop, and it's about a mile to the nearest neighborhood business district, and then maybe about 1.5 miles to 2 miles to downtown. So it's not too far out there, but finding that right site is, the most important piece, and finding something that works for the community, but that isn't all the way out, down the line is important as well.
Thank you. And who owns the structures themselves?
Our nonprofit organization. So we're a formal 501c3 organization.
Okay. So you own the structures. And if you needed to move, you can pick them up and move them if needed.
Yeah, you can put them on a trailer if you want. They're not all, a lot of the tiny houses you see, they're all built on a trailer, but that's actually a high cost in and of itself of around like $3,000, which is more than the unit cost. So, we build them on raised pier blocks. That keeps them off the ground, but it also allows you to just jack them up and put a trailer under there, and you can move them all with one trailer rather than having 30 trailers.
Right. Thank you. Are there time limits for residents in the village?
Well, so far, we've been operating on short-term leases, so that's been the limit so far. But no, as an organization, we don't have a time limit.
Okay.
We believe that each person has a unique situation and basically takes a different amount of time.
So there's some flexibility
Sure.
about that. Great.
And I can say, basically, we've seen over a dozen folks that have made the transition on their own, but we've also came to the recognition that some of the folks there aren't necessarily in a point in their life where they can achieve, financial independence, for a lot of mental reasons. So now that we've created that transitional model, we're focused on creating different types of permanent models to ideally transition folks to, and that would open up Opportunity Village to serve basically as a hub going to these various permanent models. Well, some people will still be going to already existing options. But just basically, the basic idea is creating more options. It's not that we don't have enough housing, we just don't have enough different types of housing.
Different types of housing. Great. So we have two questions that are, I know, issues here, and I'm not sure if they apply to you or not, but we should note them. One is if the Board of Supervisors has made a shelter crisis declaration, and which would instigate some actions, and also the status of SB2. I believe that these will be addressed at the workshop times, and that's a really good time to get answers to those questions. We have a question about the relationship to law enforcement.
Yeah. So we've had a really positive relationship. They established a liaison with us from the very beginning, Eric Quinco, who also was quoted up there as saying that it basically hasn't been a burden in terms of crime impact.
And another question came that I have written down lower about law enforcement was, is there any work on whether there's been a decrease in purported homeless crime issues or
in terms of like overall?
Yeah.
I don't have information on that.
Okay. How did you manage with compliance with health codes?
What health? I'm not sure.
The county health department perhaps has codes that need to be complied with.
The county health department did come out in the beginning, and we didn't have much interaction with them. It was more an interaction with the planning and building department.
Okay.
So all the buildings there are structurally to code, and we had building inspectors come out and inspect them prior to occupancy.
Okay. And have any of the small villages that you know of been aligned with or created schools for children who might be in the camp?
Have there been models that accept children? So one of the rules that we have is you got to be 18 or up, so we don't actually accept children. And I'm pretty sure any legal example out there so far is the case. Originally, we proposed this as a model for families as well, but what we found was that we have a lot of existing services in town for families, but we don't have many options for singles and couples. So.
Singles and couples, and so the village has both singles and couples.
Yeah.
Part of it. Okay. So someone has asked the question. Opportunity Village holds 35 people.
35, yeah, I was saying 30, but usually around 30.
Eureka estimates that they have 1,000 or more people who are homeless, and so what about the other 965?
Sure, yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, it is a pilot project, and part of the idea here is creating a model for a different way of thinking about homelessness rather than such a patriarchal hand-me-down sort of thing. And so basically, we created this 35-unit or 30-unit thing to basically say that this can work and go from there. But we also have, the idea that, folks falling into homelessness, they don't fall out of housing in these really bad conditions. It's a symptom of being homeless for a really long time. So by having this hub where people can catch their footing rather than having to sleep on the street for years, where they develop several, not only bad, not necessarily individual bad things, but high costs to the city. So basically having that hub where people can land, and then I think basically as a nonprofit we don't necessarily want to create another Opportunity Village because we see Opportunity Village serving its mission as then being supported by other more permanent models around it. So
are you actively okay? Are you?
We're trying to figure out what the buzzing is.
Oh, it might be me.
It's all buzzing. I hope you're all buzzing.
Okay. What is your connection with the continuum of care?
I don't know. Not very. I mean, it's
very
kind of this is kind of to be honest, yeah, it's a different approach than a lot of the folks on the continuum talking about. But we do have, Dan Bryant's on the Poverty and Homeless Board, which is basically a board that's kind of focused on the county level stuff, and so we are trying to integrate these ideas with their ideas.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, now I have a big question. A number of people asked really what your experience was with NIMBYism, with public vigilanteism about people locating in a place, or police harassment, and is there an effective response to this?
Yeah, so I talked about that first site proposal near the school, and we did have some fierce opposition there, and what we ultimately found was that was just a few really loud voices, and we think we actually had support of the overall neighborhood, but even our loudest opposition, they would tell us, this is something we need, this is a good concept, just not here. So that you're going to run into everywhere, that's always the issue. So it's just about finding that site that works for everyone, and I think that comes down to being not tied to any one site, but understanding, I never thought that we were actually going to get that site, but, it put us in the newspaper, it made Opportunity Village a thing, and from there, the city ended up finding a site that did work for people, which I found to be a pretty good location. It's not right in a residential area, but I think that's kind of a good thing to start out with because you don't have the public spotlight where you're going to have people against you no matter what you do. So,
thank you. And the outreach involved for engagement of folks who were potential participants.
Yeah.
Did you?
The outreach and
Yeah.
how did we find these folks?
How did you do that? Yes.
Like I said, we have pretty good representation on our board from folks that are in different organizations around town, and we basically just had applications available at various places around town where folks could pick them up and turn them in. Now that we're open, the village is the central location, so folks come to the village and pick up an application and fill it out, and that kind of serves also as like kind of an introductory meeting where you can kind of meet the person and
so
see.
someone actually meets with them.
Yeah.
Great. Let's see. Okay. Have you had issues, or how have you handled garbage and junk problems? Is there a recycling effort at the village?
Yeah, we have a garbage and a recycling dumpster that gets picked up on a weekly basis, just like most places. But the junk around the units, that was a concern for some folks. Basically, we adopted a rule, basically that you can't have stuff outside of the footprint of your house. Some folks have, that hasn't been followed super strictly, and some folks have made some very nice additions around their houses, like gardens and sitting areas and porches and stuff. But basically, that's where the self-management comes in, and where it's there's people there that are living there and they want a place of some quality while they're there, and they'll complain if somebody does, starts collecting too much stuff around their house.
Right.
Much like any neighborhood association.
Yeah. Does the city provide water and garbage for the?
No. So we had the unfortunate thing. It was a trailer park, which you would think would be well suited to support the utilities of something like this. But when the city took it, they actually ripped out all the utilities. So we had to start from scratch. So yeah, we dug our own water line 200 feet to the kitchen. We ran our own electricity from the nearest pole. And we pay for all that, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Folks are asking also about animals and pets.
Yeah, so we're allowed to have, folks are allowed to have pets. The city didn't want folks having cats because apparently there's already a feral cat problem in the village. But one cat showed up on the first day, and I don't think it's left the property since. And then there are a few people with dogs as well. And so I think our policy is that if you have an existing pet, that's welcome. But we don't want people going out and getting a pet just because they're there, just because we don't want everybody to have a pet. But it's worked out really well where we have maybe a handful of pets and people kind of share mutual responsibility for them.
Good. A question about if the structures are insulated and heated.
Right. So the structures are insulated. We are still finishing up the last few of those, but in terms of insulating them. But no, they're not heated, and so that's an issue. Luckily, it is pretty temperate in Eugene, where it doesn't get too cold for too long. We do have a heated yurt where folks can use the yurt to sleep in when it goes below freezing. But other than that, folks are using hot water bottles. You saw Robin there. He's developing these alternative energy sources through either solar or recycled batteries, and using those to power incandescent light bulbs, which it turns out still have a use in that they give off more heat than they do light. So if you have a small insulated space, you'd be surprised at how much insulated or incandescent light bulb can do.
Were there waivers for local and state building codes? And there's another part to this. Do these structures comply with international standards for emergency and transitional shelter?
Yeah, structurally they meet code. We were given a few exceptions, and that's part of the building code is that there's the letter of the law and the intent of the law, and when you apply it to a specific project, you can have different types of interpretation. So one of the areas where we got a little wiggle room was insulation values. So insulation values are ubiquitous no matter what the size of your structure. So even a really small house that requires very little to heat has to be insulated at the same level as a 3,000 to 6,000 square foot house. And that's actually something we're trying to change on the state level. So they basically gave us a bit of a break there. But yeah, I mean, they're approved as.
Okay.
They were approved, and I mean, the folks came out, they looked at them, we drew plans. They did give us a break in terms of, we didn't have to have a licensed architect or a licensed contractor do the project because they saw that this was a community-supported project, and they wanted to see, or they saw people stepping forward and putting forth that type of technical expertise anyways. So that cuts a lot of costs.
There is a question again about what the average size is of the buildings.
Yeah, so they're between 60 to 80 square feet. And I should also include, they don't include bathrooms or kitchens, which, by code, a dwelling has to have. But, there's also the idea of sleeping units where you have basically a room that's supported by common facilities, which isn't much different than SROs or single-room occupancy housing, which used to be a very common thing where people basically had a small individual room that was supported by a bathroom down the hall and a kitchen on a separate level. And so this is basically kind of a different way of looking at that SRO on basically an externalized, cheaper sort of way.
Okay. We have some questions about ecological and sustainability issues. One is, are you using composting toilets and solar? And you mentioned that there is some of that. And also whether you're planning for community gardens as a part of people raising some of their food and using it.
Yeah, we definitely are focused on the gardens. There's a lot of raised beds. It is a contaminated site, so that's why we are building on these raised beds. But basically, Opportunity Village was, do as much as you can with whatever you have, as quick as you have, or as quick as you can. But basically, with our next project, we're looking at, doing some more advanced features. And one of the ideas was the composting toilet, the idea that you can have a central bathroom and then supported by a common house, or composting toilets in individual units. So in Oregon, you're allowed to have composting toilets as long as there's another option on the site. So that's just something that we're talking about. But I don't know how well that was an early idea, and I don't know how much political support we'd get for that.
We have a comment that says, I can understand not having government involved, but as taxpayers, aren't we letting government off the hook to serve its people?
Yeah, definitely. So I do talk a lot about not getting public money because it allows you to do a lot more things. Public funding comes with a lot of strings attached that wouldn't necessarily let us do what we did, but I think it's important if you're going to try something new, a lot of times you have to do it on your own and then get enough attention to then get that funding. So we'd like to see that funding come in the near future, but we didn't expect it to be there from the beginning.
Okay, here are a couple of questions. Locally, some of the places that house homeless persons or serve them require religious participation. In looking at the video, it seems that that is true in your model.
No, that's not the case at all. We do have two religious folks on our board. That was a PBS special that was focused. It's called Religion and Ethics Weekly, so that's why they focused on that piece of it. But no, they're pretty open-minded people, and we don't expect any sort of that.
Thank you. A question, we've sort of talked about this a little, but transitional housing generally has a time limit. And what does that look like, and what kind of education or services are provided if people wish, I assume?
Yeah, transitional housing does traditionally have a time limit. I'm not sure how useful that is when we're, so basically we're finding out that leaving folks on the street would cost more than leaving them at Opportunity Village. So even if it's not a reason of compassion on an economic level, it makes more sense to keep them in a place like this. But what I'd like to see is sort of the rapid rehousing model that's being largely adopted, by the federal government and being passed down to the cities. Help in housing some of these folks that are more difficult, there's only so much you can do in some cases, and so I think that's part of the idea of the housing first model.
Okay, and what about seniors, accommodation for seniors, veterans, special populations like that?
We've had quite a few veterans. We haven't had a lot of seniors or a lot of really young people. We found a lot of the folks are, in their early 50s or a little younger or a little later, and I think that's just, that carries across national trends of that actual age of people historically is kind of, hit this issue from back in the 80s, and it's just perpetuated ever since.
A comment about, or ask, have you tried crowdfunding like Kickstarter or GoFund for additional funding?
Well, so with our first project, we didn't even really have a formal fundraising strategy. We just built that first Conestoga hut, and literally, money started coming in, and our most difficult thing to do was answer all the questions of how I can help. So, figuring out how to organize that at a nonprofit organizational level is one of the best things I could.
Organizing folks here is really critical, you think?
So basically, we don't necessarily have the staff or the infrastructure to respond to all those people. So basically, our philosophy is this is an opportunity for you to find a way to fit in. And so, the community education is an example of that. The professor didn't email me and ask how can I fit in. He came with this idea, and we've just had a number of ideas like that where folks have an idea of something they can contribute, and the village kind of serves as a place for that to happen.
Okay. Andrew, you have really been terrific in terms of just taking peppered questions to you.
I feel like I'm on the hot seat.
The last question we're going to ask, and there's some real specific things that people asked that I hope that you will bring up in one of the breakouts that's going to happen after we have a bite to eat. The last question for you is, what do you think is needed in Humboldt to get this started here?
Yeah, I think it's the political will. So you have to have, this is a community-supported project, so you need folks in the community that want to make it happen. But everywhere I've been so far, that hasn't been something that's lacking. It's been political support for understanding that can happen if you give it a chance. And I guess the biggest thing I can say is, I think what gave us a lot of credibility was, filling out our board and gaining some credibility, and I think that basically gave us the support from the city that we were looking for.
There you go. Now there's all kinds of ways you can participate. One last plug. This is Andrew's book. It's an amazing book, and the first 50 or 60 pages are one of the most intelligent, heartfelt, amazing dissertations on understanding homelessness and how we got there, and the rest of it is about how to get out of that. And so it reads like a novel. It's a great book, and it's a wonderful thing. I'm very happy that we got to share this. So go get one. And also now, we're going to ask you to move in the direction of having some sustenance. The tables here in front of the kitchen will have...
Sound is important. I'm going to besides that, we don't have big deals.
Community Forum with Andrew Heben from Eugene, and I'm talking with Dave Meserve, former city councilman from Arcata, and a builder of homes. And what did you think about today, Dave? What are you going to take with you?
Well, I think it's really inspiring. It's when I was on the city council, I did a lot of work towards housing the homeless, and we always ran into kind of a brick wall, let's say. And I think this gives me new hope, especially to see the turnout here today and the ideas that Andrew has and the example of Opportunity Village. And I think, again, the things that stand in the way of this moving forward are both the government standing in the way of it, not realizing how much money it ends up saving in the big picture, and also NIMBYism. And I think there are a lot of good answers that Opportunity Village has to those questions, and what I hope is that this provides the energy where we can move forward with something similar to that here. First, on a small level, I think the one disappointing thing about it is that it is only 30 people, and we need to house 1,000 people. And so it's a matter of really looking at housing first and how we can implement that here, how we can get the government behind it and get the people to push the government to do it. Because I don't think it happens just in the nonprofit world. I think it needs to have government support, and I think we need to build that here, first with the existing councils and then with perhaps changing the councils a bit where we have more support of it and where we can see housing for everybody.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we're doing here today is recognizing that as a community, it's our responsibility to house and feed and assist people who need a little bit of help from those of us who can. And we had unofficial count here today is I'd say a little over 170 people. So on a sunny Saturday, they've taken the time to come here and learn more and hopefully be motivated to get together and build some of these places.
Yeah, I see it as a great beginning. So,
thank you, Dave.
Okay, thank you.
Now we're going to talk with Sean. Okay, Sean.
Hello.
Sean Armstrong.
Yes,
Yeah, Sean is also a builder, yes.
I'm an affordable housing consultant now. I used to work for Danco Builders doing all their affordable housing work.
Okay.
And now with Michael Winkler, the city council member of Arcata, we're the nation's leading zero net energy design consultants. We specialize just in affordable housing.
Okay.
Low-income seniors, like the one next to Arcata's co-op.
Yes.
Okay, so that was one of our projects. That's the first in the country that's 103% net positive.
All right.
So they have $5 utility bills.
Well, you should be proud.
And it's how to make it more affordable.
And what you are building a tiny house.
I've got
And-
two
Okay.
that were, one's done and occupied by a farm worker, 120 square feet. And then another one's a trailer, not on the ground like the farm worker housing is. And this is more of a tiny hostel. It's a little bit prettier.
Nice. Well, what did you think about today? I mean, the unofficial count here is about 170 people. I think a lot of them are ready to go to work on this.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, what we need is just a small amount of materials and a good site. You know, but a whole bunch of people can make a good site happen. I'm very hopeful. I wanted to show this. This is a tiny house homeless cooking solution, but really for anybody. This is the Fancy Cook stove from Europe and Japan and New York City. It's called an induction burner. It's $100. This is the best one out there. $100. There's no propane tank. There's no natural gas lines extended.
These are the type of things that we were hoping to inspire her. All these great ideas now.
This is a great idea.
Yeah, okay.
You don't have to do any venting above the stove because there's no combustion of gas.
Sweet.
Nothing explodes and it doesn't catch on fire. Even if you walk away from it, it's only the pan that gets hot, not even the glass or the thing, just the pan. So it's a super safe. Plug it into a normal outlet.
If we buy 100 of them, we could probably get them down to about $70. You think?
I think you could get a bulk discount for sure. But just as a lot of the problems with tiny houses is cooking.
Yes.
And it's the propane tanks, and it's the constantly buying it, and it's the danger of it, and so this is supposed to be like a safer, simpler, cheaper solution that's right for little housing.
Well, we appreciate all
You're
your good
welcome.
work. Thank you, Sean.
The newest thing.
All right, my friend. Hang in there. We'll see you soon. Okay. Okay, well, we're here with Nina Solasi from Southern Humboldt. Beautiful woman, mother, farmer, advocate. And we would really like to hear from you about your thoughts today and what you might be taking away from this presentation.
Good, thanks for having I here. It's very much a blessing to be here and to be here with like-minded individuals and concerns of some of the community's needs. I think on a very general level, basically, I think that this is a great way to strive to allow people to become more sovereign as opposed to coming out of the system, coming out of like economic slavery as far as like in debt to things such as mortgages and lands that we might acquire through real estate, and we find ourselves having to work many years to keep these things going. And for whatever reason, if there's a breach in us being able to fulfill the terms of the agreement that we contract ourselves to, everything that we work for could possibly be jeopardized in a very short amount of time, pretty much overnight.
And usually, Nina, that's like something we're doing by ourselves. In other words, what did you think about the sense of community, the sense of belonging in these villages that are being created?
Well, I think this is really definitely the indigenous way of living. And this is definitely a way for us to become self-sufficient as a people, to govern ourselves in these small communities and be able to, be able to really be each other's keeper, because everything on a general level, we're going to make sure everyone has their needs provided for.
Beautiful.
And if there can be a model template, for instance, like some of the examples that were shown in like Southern Oregon, that's a beginning stage of a program that different things that can be adopted for other states such as California and other places that can utilize to alleviate homelessness and also to alleviate people who just don't want to be, who want more freedom in their life to do other things and want to be more a part of a community and kind of get out of this artificial or illusion of this life, and at the end it comes out to be kind of like a nightmare.
Well, I love the way you simplify things for us, and thank you very much for talking with us, and I want to be part of your village.
No problem. Well, thank you. The world is our village, and as far as like some of the solutions, as far as the land, there's possibly ways through the government, being that the government, it has public land.
Millions and millions and millions of acres.
That can be utilized for these kinds of programs to go on. And also, there's other ways that you can also achieve property in certain states through something called squatters' rights. But if we work with real estate more as a community, then things don't get privatized. And then we kind of eliminate this whole economic strategy, which is to certain people stay on top and then other people stay on the bottom, and you just keep working for someone else pretty much your whole life. For someone else's enjoyment, that they're enjoying all the whatever they're extracting from the people who are working so hard.
Exactly. So I think that we've taken a good step forward, and look at that beautiful smile. Hi. And so anyhow, we're going to be getting together in these workshops here in just a little bit. And what that means is we're going to work to start building some of these and look at the alternatives and engage the community. So that means you, community.
And we should still keep coming together like this on a regular basis.
We're going to do these probably every 4 months and come together and exchange our experiences and hook up and how we can best work together.
Towards homelessness?
Yes, you may.
I think people that are homeless, they should have a place to stay and like food and clothing and shelter. That way all the people and children can come together and like live in unity, and then maybe there should be a playground for all the children and like laundry mats and stuff like that, then free, and there should be like a utopia that everything is free and everything is like Israel vibrations.
I agree with you 100%. Thank you. And your name?
My name is Samuel.
All right, thanks, Samuel. Thanks, Nina.